Levels of consciousness. When studying the law of seven or the law of octaves, the supreme example is the ray of creation, which shows how there are different levels or notes. Do, ti, la, and so on, descending to re, which represents in our case the smallest, most undeveloped part, our moon. According to the law of octaves, notes of the descending octave involve more and more laws, and of course the inverse is also true. A part is under more laws than the whole. The moon is under 96 laws or orders of laws, the earth under 48 laws, and the summit Do, the absolute, is under no laws, save the laws of its own unity, creation. From this is seen that the lower down anything stands in the octave, the more laws it falls under. In other words, the will of the Absolute does not reach us directly, but in the form of 48 orders of laws, which produce, in their varying combinations, the conditions of our life. Any organization or organism is built according to the law of three and law of seven in the same way as the whole universe, which is a vast organism. As above, so below, taking organic life, which is itself an organism, spread like a thin film over the earth, to receive and transmit influences from the sun, other planets of our solar system, and galaxies of this universe. Humanity is an organism within organic life. We are a minute part, a tiny cell within that body of organic life, comparable to a brain cell in someone's body, constructing thence an octave between organic life and man. P.D. Ouspensky asked his students to reflect upon this, and at the same time, he himself constructed an octave, as illustrated herein. If we think in terms of the law of octaves, and the modern evolution of society on Earth, if we study the octave illustrated, then we should see that at the place of shock, between the notes mi and fa, something is necessary to make ascending force pass from national consciousness to a regional, more united consciousness. Citizens as Do have reached the patriarchal or family system Re, then later reach the consciousness of the note mi, attaining national consciousness. The British, for example, feel themselves as individuals, they identify as families, and they have a sense of national pride. In this they sound three notes, Do, Re and Mi, but it took a while for them to feel like Europeans, and so they have always struggled to sound the note Fa. They seem to balk at the idea of being conscious as Europeans, at that level. In this regard it is as if the British come up against some mental block, against something that requires a shock for them to get past. At the level of consciousness belonging to the note Re, the organism which we have termed their local community, it would be absurd for them to lock themselves up in their houses, then try to hurl insults at one another. Everyone would know that it was ridiculous, in the same way all European conflict is equally ridiculous. The Franco-Prussian War, and both world wars were criminal wars, as is the situation in the Ukraine, quite different from earlier conflicts, when there were fewer means of communication. Technology escalates scale to an entirely different level, never before seen, until it engulfs the whole of humanity. Europe is like an apartment building. For one flat or apartment to make war on another is criminal, and liable to destroy the entire block, for just as man himself is an organism, and a family or class is an organism, a nation too is an organism. So too the European Union and NATO have become an organism, particularly through the development of modern technology and communication. These have increased the power of governments, as is obvious, so that if a government is bad, then the situation becomes bad too, far worse than it used to before Europe had the possibility of becoming an organism. There is no nation in the European Union that can survive without another nation, just as there is no organ in a person's body that can exist without its other organs. All evolution is the ascent of an octave. Psychological evolution is an increase of consciousness on its part, a bringing together of more things into unity, because consciousness means a knowing together. In the same way the evolution of our emotions is a bringing together, a harmonization of many different feelings, and this elevates consciousness. Then the two in synchrony, this knowing together and feeling together, are the lines of psychological evolution, both for the individual themselves and for humanity. The situation in Europe over the past 2 centuries was due to a lack of development in conscious awareness, beyond the national level, beyond the note mi, in the constructed octave linking organic life to humanity. The single individual must first of all belong to a group of some kind, be part of a herd, which in turn is connected with a larger organization. The more one studies the law of seven, the more we see that it is a uniting framework, a structure, as it were, for all forms of life, either psychological or physical. Everything is united, everything connected together, and nothing can exist independently in isolation, yet each has its own individual existence, although connected with what is below it and what is above it. P.D. Ouspensky used to dwell on this point periodically, and emphasized that everything is connected, that nothing exists in isolation. He would point out that people's consciousness is so poorly developed in this regard, so much so that we do not realize that all our food comes from the sun. Much like GI Gurdjieff, he would say that the object of this work is to increase our consciousness. It is not, they both felt, based upon faith, hope, or love, although all these are of course included. What is emphasized is consciousness. Gurdjieff constantly spoke about the necessity for the development of consciousness, and would compare the inner working of our being with complex machines that operate practically in the dark. The first development of consciousness is to become conscious of personality, of the many different I's that it's made up of, some constructive and others utterly useless. This is a definite development of consciousness. Then from this step it is possible to develop consciousness still further, by becoming conscious of another person. Without, however, being far more conscious of oneself, we cannot become conscious of another, save in an illusory manner, through imagination and very often projection. We have first of all to be able to bear ourselves, to accept our own lives, before we can tolerate the presence of others. These developments of consciousness are comparable with developments shown in the octave, between organic life and humanity. Each step seems to represent an increase of consciousness. In the case of the individual, self-study carried out along the right lines leads to a new note being sounded within. We need not discuss which note, but with the beginning of the sounding of that note, we experience quite new sensations of ourselves, many new feelings. Even becoming somewhat unfamiliar to ourselves, and if we do not know what is happening, then one might think that something is going in the wrong direction. However, if we begin to leave the room in which we have always sat, then we shall increasingly find ourselves in new situations. The development of European consciousness, with the whole of old Europe being drawn together into some new organism, meant experiencing sensations and feelings never encountered before. National pride was no longer exhibited in quite the same ways or connected as before. Many feared a loss of something which they regarded as important. However, it was precisely that loss of something that enabled a new note to sound in their individual psychological evolution. There must be a loss of something for a new note to sound, as all forms of vanity and most forms of pride must necessarily change and cease to give us their diverse inner satisfactions, as they have hitherto done. At the same time, the conditions under which a new note sounds in the octave of one's own development will necessitate an increase of consciousness with regard to knowing and feeling more together, giving rise to a union of sovereign nations. If we could know everything, then our present feeling of ourselves would completely change. Fortunately, we cannot do this, as it would likely drive us insane, becoming aware at once of all the contradictions of our lives. In order that we should not see these contradictions, an application called buffers is introduced at an early age, with the inevitable result of a narrowing of consciousness. An increase of consciousness implies ultimately the weakening of buffers. The same parallel can be drawn with regard to an increase of consciousness in the other octave. For each nation to be at the level of a unified Europe, many national buffers have to disappear. Recall that real will is not exactly making decisions or negations, but consists of finding solutions. For this reason, with limited consciousness, we can scarcely expect to have real will. In order to do so, we must be able to be conscious of a number of things together, and not merely one at a time. With our narrow consciousness we see only one thing, and then another, and then a third, therefore cannot make any connection between them because they all seem to us opposites, and hence mutually irreconcilable. Recall the Eastern allegory of sages, who had to examine an elephant in the dark. One felt the tail, while another felt the trunk, another the ear, and so on. Then, in the end, each gave an entirely different description to the caliph. Our situation is somewhat like that. If we could but see the whole elephant, we could assign it order, and understand what all the different parts were. However, as it is, we see little bits at a time, Then try to formulate aim and have will about these small parts without seeing their connection with some whole. Even such as we are, however, we can have small aim and believe that we have will to keep it. But the supreme aim, without which we may never reach master or realize, is this work and all that it entails. This is paraphrased in the Gospels as, quote, "Seek ye first the kingdom of heaven and its righteousness, then all these things shall be added unto you." How can we really expect, save for purposes of experiment and observation, to get any result from making aims based on self-will? How can we expect that in this way our consciousness will be able to increase beyond its present level? The whole idea of will must first become intelligent. We may have to sail north and south, then even east and west at times, in order to cross the Atlantic and discover America. If we have a degree of real self-observation, however, if we have sounded the dough of this work strongly enough, and if above all we feel that we cannot lose hold of this work, then although one may find they have often to go in apparently contradictory ways, which are mostly confusing, something yet may give us some kind of inner feeling when we are going in the wrong direction. But it will never tell us when we are going on the right path. In the parable of the horse, carriage and driver, when the driver is up upon the box with reins in hand, they must start off as best they can. Then the master may be found sitting in the carriage, and could call out instruction or give direction. Remember that real will or master comes down from a higher level, and cannot reach our ordinary so-called waking state of consciousness. Something must be awake in us to have first contact, and that means there must be some state of self-remembering present to collect and gather ourselves, to recall what has taken place and why. Where one has been, what worked and what did not appear to work very well. After a time we can begin to tell when we are asleep inside, when there is no kind of self-remembering taking place. It is said that when we find ourselves in difficulty, that the work will find a way for us. This is indeed so, because help is at hand, but only once we feel the work and begin to value it. It must be in us, not merely something outside, part of our Sunday morning routine and sense of communion. When we have affection for something, when we truly value a thing, it is in us, forming part of who we have become. The master can speak through the work, and the work can speak to us, but the master cannot speak to us directly.